In the last lecture, we had a look at string interpolation, which is a great tool for outputting data in a template. Now I want to have a look at property binding. Now, one important information right away, there are a lot of times where you can either use property binding or string interpolation. And I will show what I mean in a second. Let's go to our servers component where we manage all the servers. And I want to allow the user to add new servers. At least soon I want to allow that. So we will need a button where I say add server on it, and I would just add some CSS classes button and button primary to make this button look nice. This is all using normal Bootstrap CSS classes though, nothing to do with Angular. And to reflect this change in my servers component here, I also want to comment out the inline template and point to the external template again. So template URL should point to my servers component .html file like this. So now with this, if I save this, we see that button here. Right now, it doesn't make any sense that I'm able to click this button because it doesn't do anything. We haven't learned to react to a button click yet. So I will add a new property in my TypeScript code here, which I'll name allow new server and set it to false. So now this is also another property holding a Boolean value. So true or false, in this case false, because I don't want to allow the user to create a new server. And you could again imagine that this is somehow derived dynamically. We will soon work with some dynamic data. So in the HTML file here, I now want to disable the button. And as you probably know, there is a disabled attribute you can add, like this. If we now save this, the button is disabled, I can't click it. That's nice, but that's hard-coded into HTML. Now maybe this allow new server code here changes, however. Maybe it's not set to this all the time. So then we wouldn't be able to react to this. And I can actually demonstrate this by, for now, in the constructor, which is simply a method executed at the point of time this component is created by Angular. By there, calling setTimeout, a normal JavaScript function. And here I define after which period of time or after how many milliseconds something should happen. So after 2000 milliseconds, which are 2 seconds, I want to execute a function. And here I'm using an ES6 arrow function. This syntax might look strange. It's almost the same as function like this, with some differences when it comes to handling the this keyword. But in the end, here you pass the arguments and here you have the function body. More importantly, in here, I can set allow new server, and now this would not work in the other syntax because this would then be referring to something else, can set it to true. So after 2 seconds, this will be switched to true, and since we hard-coded this, of course this doesn't affect our button here at all. It stays disabled. So I want to bind it to allow new server. So now to make this disabled functionality dynamic, we can bind to it by enclosing it in square brackets. Square brackets indicate to Angular that we're using property binding, that we want to dynamically bind some property, and disabled, the HTML attribute, in the end, in normal HTML, only sets a specific property on the underlying DOM element. You might know that each HTML element you use is parsed by the browser and kind of translated into an element on the document object model. This is totally unrelated to Angular. And therefore we have an element in this DOM, and this element has a couple of properties. A lot of these can't even be set through attributes on the HTML element. Well, one of the properties is the disabled property, and you can set it through the disabled attribute, but here we're not using the disabled attribute anymore. With these squared brackets, we are directly binding to this native disabled property this HTML element has. So now we can set this equal to, and now between the quotation marks here, an expression which for this property resolves to a Boolean, but for other properties another type might be required. Because again, you can bind to a lot of properties, basically to all the HTML element properties. We'll soon learn that there are also other properties you can bind to. So for now I can simply pass allow new server here, my property name, because this will resolve to true or false, exactly the value the disabled the property needs because it has to decide whether it should be disabled or not. So now with that, if we reverse this, so by adding an exclamation mark, we made sure that this is only disabled if this is false. So if allow new server is not true, otherwise we would do exactly the opposite. So now with the exclamation mark, if we go back to the app, you see it's disabled, but after 2 seconds, let me reload this, it becomes enabled. Because now we're binding to this disabled property, this native element property, we're binding this to our own TypeScript property here. And the convenient thing is, and this is what Angular is all about, that this will update dynamically. So once allow new server changes, this is changed in the DOM, so now the button gets enabled. One of the main reasons why you use Angular, it makes it very easy for you to interact with your DOM to change some things there at runtime like we do here. That is property binding in place. Now, as I mentioned, besides binding to HTML element properties like we do here, you can also bind to other properties, for example of directives, something we haven't learned about yet, and your own components, something I will also show you later. So this is property binding. Before moving on to the other two forms of data binding, let's find out where you could actually use string interpolation instead of property binding.